you will surely be aware of the character of Judge Dredd. This brutal lawman policing the dystopian metropolis of Megacity 1 has loomed large in the cultural imagination for decades. But what can you tell us about the state of policing in the real world? Joining us this evening is author Michael Molcher, economist, journalist, podcaster, and publicist, whose day job is Brown 9 for 2018. It's a fascinating book, I Am the Law. It explores how the character of Dredd was both inspired by developments of post-war British policing and predicted the future of them. In an age of criminalised protest and militarised police, the character now seems more relevant than ever. Please join me in welcoming Michael. So, we're on the format this evening. Mike and I are going to have a discussion, and then I'll open up to audience questions. So, put your thinking caps on, and then if there's a new ball, we'll sign some books. Thanks. So, the first thing I wanted to ask was: this is a very well-researched book, and there's a real sense of passion about it as well. Is this something you can think about writing for a long time?
Yes and no. I think somebody asked me this recently, and I guess kind of the roots of it go all the way back to when I first encountered Judge Dredd. In fact, I've not told them this to their faces, possibly for the best, but looking back, John Wagner and Alan Grant, the two primary writers of the Golden Age, were effectively kind of like my other dads. So, my parents were incredibly influenced on my life in a way, but I think that the two people whose thoughts and work I've absorbed more than anybody else are these two, incredible Scottish writers. And the actual genesis of the book came from we did a part work, so Judge Dredd part work. So issue 1, 99p from your local newsagents, etc., called the Judge Dredd Mega Collection, and that started in 2015. And I was very fortunate that I was in the planning meeting where we agreed to do it, so I was able to put up my hand and go, "I'll do the back matter for those if you want. Thank you very much." Most of them were just interviews or straightforward bits of history. But a few of them, I just started to lean into the ideas behind Dredd and some of the themes. And I haven't mentioned this in any interviews yet, but I was reminded that when we did the talk at the Cartoon Museum in London last week, feels like months ago, where a friend, I was interviewed by Ian Dunn, who's a political columnist, he's a good friend of mine, and in the pub afterwards, there was a mutual friend. And I was reminded that one of the spurs for researching and writing the book was the fact that he berated both me and Ian for using the terms fascism and authoritarianism wrong in one of the articles. And rather than kind of dig my heels and go, no, I'm right, I kind of went, oh, okay, well, I'll go off and think about this a bit more. And I did, and it kind of evolved. And I pitched the book. The pitch, which does not resemble the book that sat just there, pretty much in any way, shape, or form. I pitched it a month after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and by the time I properly started writing, there was the January the 6th insurrection in America, and you got the side of Donald Trump tweeting law and order with multiple exclamation marks after it. Priti Patel promising instant justice for protesters who had the audacity to take objection to the statue. And what I was reading, even straightforward text, there's a book called The Politics of the Police by Robert Reiner, who's a very well-known criminologist. It's a textbook. It's not, it's nothing like it's on the syllabus at, I was about to say Sandhurst, but that's not the police training college, but, the police training college, Henley. Henley on Thames. Hendon, thank you. Henley's a lot nicer, as it turns out. Yeah, it's on the syllabus at Hendon, and reading that and looking at some of the threads in the history of policing, the more I read, not only did did it chime more and more with the Judge Dredd stories that I was revisiting, but it was almost inevitably, inexorably leading me towards a kind of abolitionist viewpoint and an analysis of the law and order politics that arose in the 1970s. And by the time Dredd came along in 1977, we're in full bloom. And with the kind of basis for not just Thatcher's victory in 1979, but also her regime. And what has happened over the preceding decades is that this mentality, this almost Nietzschean view of the world and humanity has come to completely overtake all of our politics. And then you look at Judge Dredd, and Judge Dredd, not only the Justice Department, just so I know my audience, hands up who knows Judge Dredd, who's read a fair bit. Okay, majority of the audience. I won't go into too granular detail, but Justice Department is the government of Mega City 1, of this vast dystopian city. And I say in the book, it controls everything from welfare to warfare. So in the stories of Dan Abnett, the Justice Department has vast space armadas that can go off into the depths of space. But also they deal with the quotidian details of everyday life. And certainly a lot of the books I was reading were talking about how policing and the idea of security has overtaken everything. So everything is now a matter of security, food security, energy security. War becomes a matter of policing. You can't write about these things and not draw that parallel. It would actually be an abrogation of responsibility. So very long answer to your question, but that's going to be the basic format of all my answers this evening.
That's fine. That's great. It's a very good answer. It's a very potent image, actually, the idea of the police being co-tenants with the state. It's delightfully dystopian. So one thing I was going to ask you about is you mentioned at one point in the book that Dredd was not a planned satire, but in which case, what do you think the intentions of John Wagner and other creators were with the beginning of the character?
To make money and to have a laugh. And in doing so, I think the character has this extraordinary authenticity because there's no bullshit about the characters at all. Because ultimately, these weren't kind of auteurs who were labouring away at an original graphic novel for years while living off cabbage soup. These were jobbing journeymen who were producing content for a weekly comic. Now, because weekly comics have become less of a feature of particularly the comics landscape, but just in general our society, you kind of forget how much content they eat. In my day job, I watch Matt Smith, who's the current editor of 2000 AD, just basically shoveling stuff into this absolute beast. There's no room for error. There's no latitude that kind of, that it can't go to print late. And so what makes it incredible is that when you look at around about 1981, 1982, 1983, John Wagner and Alan Grant were writing so much of 2000 AD that the management were telling them to use pseudonyms so that people didn't know how much of 2000 AD they were writing. They were writing Judge Dredd, they were writing Strontium Dog, they were writing Ace Trucking Co., they were writing Robo Hunter, and all the other little stories that they did as well. And that's incredible. And so I think what that produced was they weren't necessarily thinking about satire. What they were doing was looking for story. Right. And looking for authenticity. So it's this image I always have in my mind. That there was a Sunday Telegraph article when Titan Publishing launched American format reprints in the States of Judge Dredd. So they did a feature on John and Alan. There's 2 images of them. And my favourite one is of them in the garden of Alan's spacious but drafty farmhouse home near Colchester. And Alan had this wild mane of hair, these big thick glasses, he's wearing a leather jacket, and for some reason they've given him an air gun. And he's kind of leaning forward, he's kind of looking off into the distance. And John, who's this wonderfully taciturn Scottish-American hulk of a man, but with a really sharp, mischievous wit, he sat down holding a copy of like a Judge Dredd angle, looking absolute, and pardon my French, looking absolutely fucking miserable. And he assures me he wasn't as miserable as he looked. But the other image is of them in their writing space, which was the living room. And they're on beanbags. And the day's papers are spread out in front of them. And they would read them and basically make jokes about it. And turn, take the ideas, take the sinews of these stories and turn them up to 11 and then just dial them back a little bit. And, one of them would then type it up for 2000 AD. And this produced this constant work rate. But it meant that I don't think they were ever really kind of laboring on the notion of the satire. They were plugged into the events of the day. And because they couldn't take a breath, they were reaching into the truth of the matter, which produced the satire. But wasn't necessarily something that I think was thoroughly intended at the start.
So it is more a case than being just steeped in the culture of the day, what was happening, and that coming out in what they were writing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh no, and their senses of humour as well.
Yeah.
I think that's key. There's a quote at the very beginning of the book from Ed Neumeyer, who wrote Robocop, and he says, if you want to predict the future, make a joke. Think how bad things could get, and then make a joke out of it. It's on the first page for a reason, because that's basically the Judge Dredd formula. So I think they were just past masters at it. No one's really done any better.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, that kind of dark sense of humor is also one of the defining features of 2000 AD tradition. So yeah, definitely. Do you think there's a point at which the satire became more deliberate, perhaps when new creators got involved at some point later on? Or?
No, I think it was earlier than that. And it was when John and Alan realised that some of our readers weren't getting the point. And I've sat in the archives at work on a day off. This tells you how dedicated I was. I actually got up and went to the archive and searched for this mythical letter that they talk about in the letters page. And I don't think it was actually ever published, but they talk about a letter from a reader saying, how Dredd was the hero, and they objected to him being portrayed as inefficient in some way. And that kind of made them realise that maybe some of the readers didn't get it. And so what that produces in terms of solid action was a letter from a Democrat, which was 1986, 87, where originally it was meant to be a terrorist group called the Baffin Island Nudists. Because everything's ridiculous in Mega City 1. And then I think this is the influence of Alan Grant on the whole thing. They realised actually it was better in the topsy-turvy world of Mega City 1 to make the terrorists Democrats. Like what's more startling, what's more contrasting than having terrorists who want democracy? And it's a remarkable story, incredible polemic. And where I think it works, and I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit here, but the epistle in John Wagner uses the form of the epistle several times, and he always does it to illustrate inner voice, because the one thing we never truly hear is Dredd's inner voice, because he doesn't have one. What we get, a third-party narration of what he's thinking, or we get it written down. But in the case of Letter from a Democrat, it's a woman explaining, the mother explaining how she became radicalized. And it boils down to they were playing in the park with their children, and this ball that their son was playing with hit a judge. And the judge kind of towers over this child and terrifies the child. You know, what kind of world are we leaving these children? You know, just one of constant fear, because her and her husband, like so much of the population of Megacity 1, just had come to accept the way it was. So you have leftists from Democrat. They all die at the end because, of course, Judge Dredd. It doesn't quite work though, because leftists keep coming in. They keep having conversations, signings, and things like that. And so then they do Revolution, where Hester Hyman, who's the mother from Democrat, has become a martyr, and the fragmented democracy movement has kind of coalesced around her. And there's going to be this huge march on the Hall of Justice to demand the restoration of democratic control of the city. And this is the point where I think they played their absolute masterstroke, because they made subtext text right in front of you without any apology. And so they made it beyond a shadow of a doubt that Dredd is the bad guy. And they showed in incredible detail the things he will do, the lengths he will go to protect the system. And beyond that point, if anybody reading Judge Dredd thinks he's the good guy, well, I mean, there's absolutely no arguing with them whatsoever. Yeah. You know, but you know, Revolution is such an incredible story, because there's this moment where Chief Judge Silver, who's, you know, the bureaucrat in chief of Megacity 1, says to Dredd, you know, I want this movement crushed by any means possible. And Dredd says, does that involve breaking the law? And Silver said, on this, you write the law. And in the past, I've seen people describe this as being uncharacteristic and therefore not canon. But what Silver's doing is he's not saying, yes, you can break the law. What he's doing is he's reminding Dredd that he has all the power he needs. Yeah. Like, there's no need to break the law, because he is the law, as he reminds us on a regular basis. So then he engages in this, you know, program of dirty tricks, you know, torturing people, concocting misinformation, fake news about the Democratic leaders. And then there's the moment when the march, you know, the march is diminished, but it's still like 16 million strong. And there's this moment, and this is to bring it back to the book, there's this moment where infiltrators, Justice Department infiltrators in the crowd, start throwing stones at the judges. And that's the excuse that the judges need to wade in. And I did an event this week at Book House in Bristol. And I met somebody who is working with the victims of the Spy Cops scandal. And she asked me, you know, is there anything in Dredd about that? And I went, well, yeah, absolutely. This, because literally the week that episode was published, so the infiltrators giving the judges the excuse to do what they wanted, an undercover police officer who had infiltrated a animal rights group firebombed a department store, specifically so they could pin it on that group and use it as an excuse to suppress that group. And that's the disturbing bits of the process of researching the book, is how often, because bear in mind that story will have been written 6 months before, yeah, but only saw print then. It's disturbing how often it looks like it's literally torn from that week's headlines, yeah, but it's had to be written and, you know, drawn and lettered and everything, and you know. Did that answer your question? Because I've got a really bad habit of doing this. Right, okay, good.
Yeah, it did. Right. Because at that point it's becoming, there's a deliberateness to what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it was out of a seeming necessity because people aren't getting it. Mm. And I guess from their perspective, there's a concern that they are being interpreted as endorsing that kind of thing. Yeah. Which, you know, and always, there's always that kind of leeway with authorship where, you know, there's interpretation, but I don't imagine maybe it was people that way.
I mean, ultimately, it's the problem with satire. So, what's noticeable about, I don't mean to sound incredibly old, but I am going to use the words these days, is that an awful lot of satire has to be quite explicit. It has to be quite didactic. It has to say what it means. So you kind of a political cartoon kind of satire, because anything more subtle than that has a tendency to be misinterpreted. And Neil Gaiman references this in the Future Shock documentary from 2015, where he said the genius of Dredd and the problem with Dredd is he is the thing and the critique of the thing. So any satire that clothes itself in the garb of the thing it's satirizing runs the risk of being mistaken for the thing.
Yeah,
you know, and that's certainly true of Dredd. I think one thing I didn't really explore in the book, there's this idea of the authoritarian personality. Now, that's a thing that Adorno and a few other writers came up with in the 1960s, and it was heavily criticised at the time because their research was a little bit dodgy. But more recently, I can't remember the name of the academic. They were talking about how psychologically, probably between 20 and 40% of the population have an authoritarian personality, in that they either are willing to submit to dominion or willing to participate in dominion. So that their personality means that they see the world in very black and white terms. They have an uncomplicated relationship with power, and are willing to use power themselves. So, you know, you can trace that back to kind of your Hannah Arendt, kind of, you know, the banality of evil, the Eichmann trial and things like that. And I think ultimately there are always going to be people who misinterpret that. In the same way there are people who misinterpret the Punisher. It's a different character, but, you know, as many people have pointed out to me, you know, it's the Punisher logo that cops are putting on their cars in America. And once you get that level of dislocation of a symbol from its origin, you can't do. You've entered the realm of memes, and at that point you've got no control over it whatsoever. Yeah, well, absolutely.
No, that's great. It makes a lot of sense. I think what I wanted to ask about next was kind of a bit different. Where you talk in the book about the kind of evolution of pop cultural depictions of the police, particularly after the Second World War, you know, the journey from Dixon and Dr. Green to the Sweeney, for example. And then, I mean, that continues right up to the present in terms of how it's portrayed on TV and film. Where do you situate Dredd relative to other cultural depictions of police? I mean, you obviously couldn't call it propaganda, and maybe it's the opposite of that, but how do you see it in that respect? Well,
so again, this is one of the difficulties. I read a review recently of we just started a new series. I'm not doing this intentionally, by the way. I realise what my day job is. I'm not doing a marketing exercise. It is relevant. We just started a new series called The Best of 2000 AD, and the second volume has a story by Al Ewing and drawn by Colin Wilson called Magic Bullets, and it's basically about this guy who develops like these self-propelling bullets that you can throw. It's like you know, you can assassinate everybody and it's untraceable and all that. And this particular reviewer read this story. It's a great Dredd story. This particular reviewer who had no real interaction with Dredd as a character read it and went, well, where's the satire? He catches the guy. He's quite efficient. Isn't this propaganda? And you kind of can't argue with that on the basis that that's the only thing they've read. So I think kind of culturally, even when you're satirizing something by like the police, you kind of have to spend so much time creating that ambiguity. If somebody just comes to the character and sees it and they go, oh, he's a really efficient cop. Well, yes, like you can't argue that. But also, he's efficient because of the system that allows him to do whatever he wants. Really interesting, actually. I saw a critique, possibly in these states, of Happy Valley. And the depiction of police in that, and how disturbing it is that literally, Yvette Cooper, who's the Shadow Home Secretary, I don't know what the character's name is in the show, I've not watched it, said, what we need is one of these characters in every town.
Yeah.
And that crossover between culture and politics and policing is why we're in this mess in the first place. So the thread of the book is how these imaginings, this cultural notion of the police as being benign guardians, the thin blue line, all these images. Thatcher in the late 70s talked about putting a wall of steel in front of protesters and strikers, all these images that appeal to strength and stability and power. It's brainworms. Once you start viewing the world that way, it's very difficult to stop viewing it that way, because any retreat from that, and you're at risk of being accused of being soft on crime, of not caring about victims and all that. And so the thing that I discovered fairly early on is that the police are as much a cultural institution as they are a practical institution. And this came about because I was talking to David Alan Green, who's a quite famous legal commentator. And I did a bit of reading, and I asked him about the whole, it used to be Dixon of Dock Green, and then it became Dirty Harry and the Sweeney. And he went, yeah, it did. But what about before Dixon of Dock Green? And so I went back and did some reading. And Dixon of Dock, the image of the police, as personified by Dixon of Dock Green, only really exists for about 20 or 30 years in the mid-20th century period. And this ties into the notion of policing by consent, which is this slogan that particularly the Metropolitan Police just bring out whenever they've done something wrong. Oh, no, we need your consent to keep doing what we're doing. Yes, but you just did something bad. So, can we withdraw the consent? Is that no? Okay.
For people who aren't familiar with it, would it be fair to describe Dixon Doctrine as a kind of the archetypical sort of local Bobby on the beat kind of?
Bobby on the beat, yeah, the great British Bobby. The notion of a benign, fatherly, hand on the shoulder, guiding society, and it's a fiction. Not just in terms of the character, but the kind of English, and it is England. The English idyll, I mean, it is an adult idyll, but of the post-war period, I think Policing by Consent and Dixon Doctrine come out really of the work of the great British historian of police, Charles Rees, who in the 1940s developed the idea of policing by consent as a kind of way of trying to explain why Britain did not succumb to fascism or communism. Like, why did liberal democracy survive the early to mid 20th century, whereas liberal democracy in other countries have completely fallen apart? And he fixated on the role of the policeman, this idea that the police in Britain, particularly in England, are not saber-wielding gendarmes or schutzmen, these kind of paramilitary European forces, but actually are much more guardians. And in the post-war period, where everybody was like, yeah, we're all getting on, it's going to be great in the future, that kind of works. But Robert Reiner wrote about how the police can maintain social order. They cannot create it. So when you get to the 1960s and things start to change, these great movements in Britain and America and elsewhere for equal rights, for sexual rights, for gender rights, for the rights of the young, economic rights. Britain experiences mass migration for the first time, even though the numbers were still absolutely tiny. Change is terrifying because it calls into question everything people took for granted in the past. And so you have this great big reactionary, again, not unified, but in lots of different ways, this reactionary backlash. In America, it took the form of the kind of Nixonian silent majority. In Britain, it was Thatcher's kind of, weird semi-proletariat Toryism And the police are at the centre of that because they're the only force in society, particularly when you have a right-wing movement that wishes to gut the state. The police really are the only power you want to have. And Friedrich von Hayek, who's the kind of spiritual god, let's put it that way, of Margaret Thatcher, amongst others, he basically said there should be no state apart from law and order. Everything should be run by markets. So the police begin to take on a great role, and they love it because at the same time, the police are a deeply conservative, both small C and big C institution. So they start talking about how crime is out of control, and the Police Federation, which until that point has been like a minor quasi non-union, they start kind of tub thumping about law and order, unironically borrowing from the tactics of the kind of social pressure groups from the 1960s and early 70s. One of their campaigns is, "What is political about crime?" So they start to be this political force, and certainly by the 1990s, police and by consent, law and order have melded into this situation where you can't question it. And bringing it back to Dredd, he represents that kind of depoliticized, practical, I call it the cast iron law of necessity way of viewing the world. It's necessary. Any criticism is political, but we are necessary. We're practical. We know because we're the people on the street. And so there's been this feedback loop from politics to culture to policing and back again. So the image of the police that we now hold in our minds is one very much divorced from their history and even their place in society. Again, that was really long-winded, and I apologise. Maybe I should have just done a reading, or just like the book.
No, it's good to hear an expansion on these kind of basic ideas, because there's so much there for people. I mean, in some ways, Dredd seems like a kind of a mega point of that alienated form of policing, of the reality of policing beneath the veneer of the kind of village police officer that everybody knew personally, that kind of thing. I mean, that's something that's reinforced. You talk about the way the judges are kind of like a monk-like order, and there is an element of almost religious esotericism to the judges. Both symbolically, but also how they treat society. They are this kind of separate class with privileged resources, that kind of thing. So it's very interesting to think about that being an extreme, using that extreme point of development to then look at policing in the second half of the century.
And it's also worth noting that the judges are the liberal view of the police. The idea that if we just strip out enough of more technology, more resources, more training, we can just eventually make the perfect policeman, because a liberal democracy requires the policeman in lots of different ways. Now, I won't, we're on relatively limited time, so I won't go into the depths of that one. But Dredd embodies this liberal notion that if we just strip away enough of their humanity, we just, do this, and this, give them all these resources, just make them do this, make them roll down, make them monk-like, then they'll be fair. Yeah. And it's as much a fiction as Mega City 1 is, because you're never... The satire of Judge Dredd is that if you want fair policing, you have to bring policing down to such a level that everyone becomes a criminal.
Yeah. There's something almost Rawlsian about that.
Yeah.
The idea of you have to operate from behind a barrier, like a separate from society, but in reality, it cannot be separate.
Yeah. And the ultimate thing is that Judge Dredd is a vision of everyone being treated the way that we treat black people, the way that the police always treated the poor. And what a horror show! Hilarious, but what a horror show! Like. You laugh at these stories, but you know that they're dark. In the conclusion, I say, Judge Dredd is a hollow laugh delivered in front of a gallows. And genius for me of John Wagner and Alan Grant is that they understood that so well. And you know, I've interviewed John last year, and he mentioned that because he grew up in Pennsylvania, and yes, sorry, a little voice in my head just went, "You sure about that?" Pennsylvania or Ohio? It's America. Let's Ohio. There we go. Yeah, it's Ohio. Yeah. There's a lot of information pinging around in here. And you know, he started getting in trouble with the police. Like at one point, he said to me, "Oh, I need, you know, burn down a block of flats." I was like, "Excuse me?" He didn't, but he did start a fire that nearly burned down a block of flats. So you know, you had some moments with the police, but then you get Alan Grant, who genuinely had experience of the injustice of the justice system. You know, he'd been jailed for having like a quarter tab of LSD, and the police when he was up in Aberdeen, I think, or Dundee. See what it's getting like. It's two options. I'm going to choose one of them every time. Yeah, the police sat outside his flat. Unfortunately, he lived with a load of people who took psychotropic substances, and so they got quite paranoid about the fact there was a man sat in a car outside all the time. But you know, they bring this in. I mean, I make a point in the book of referring to it as the criminal legal system, because in the same way that when Dredd talks about justice, he's not talking about justice; he's talking about order. To call it the criminal justice system is just demonstrably incorrect.
I'm going to turn to audience questions shortly, but one last thing I want to ask you just now. You mentioned a few already, but I mean, particularly when it comes to policing, lack of political memory seems to be an issue. I mean, in this country and elsewhere, because when you've got, for example, remote members of the left from bench banging on about law and order and using that terminology that actually is quite loaded if you stretch back in the 70s even. But things like, you know, artifacts like Dredd, I think, have a role of chronicling these things, trying to aid that. And you've mentioned a few already, but are there particular storylines or a few particular storylines from the comics that you think are really distinctly potent as kind of satire, but also as chronicling developments of policing in the last 50
years? Yeah.
It's probably helping to narrow down.
Well, I'll just say yes. Yes, there are. No, I think the problem is that it saturates the whole thing so much. I mean, America is the obvious one, which was the I mean, it's not even a story about Judge Dredd, which was in the Judge Dredd magazine when it was in 1990, and that's a remarkable. I mean, that, you know, Francis Fukuyama was talking about the end of history a few years later, and John Wagner to have written a story like that as the Berlin Wall was falling, and to have shown what awaited us with the victory of liberal democracy. I mean, that's just stunning. I mean, there's some very obvious ones, usually written by Alan Grant, because Alan had a knack of not really hiding the subtlety or the satire. So there's one where I can't remember what it's called, but it's about who's being elected as like city mayor or head of the council or whatever. And the main guy is the guy with this huge grin and coiffed hair, and he's the head of the Liar Party. And you kind of go, yeah, no, actually, that's great. No questions. So but yeah, I think the problem is it runs through as a thread from at least the very beginning, but also once John Wagner properly gets onto writing Judge Dredd after The Cursed Earth in 1979. I think it's just there, always beating away in the background. Of course, you know, by the 1990s, as you allude to, you know, Labour, Tony Blair, realised the Conservatives could be outflanked on law and order politics. So you develop an arms race. So where him and then Home Secretary Michael Howard are just trying to outdo each other about how punitive they can be, you know. And then you get tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, which sounds like a liberal policy, but really isn't. And by that point, it's kind of too late. You know, both the major parties, and even the Liberal Democrats now, are fully indoctrinated into the law and order mentality. So the choices are there. And you have a situation where the Police Federation can openly say the Home Secretary does not have the confidence of the police, which is one of the most profoundly undemocratic things I think I've ever heard. And I'm not even commenting on the quality of the Home Secretary. So, but yeah, I think there's plenty of stories. Again, I realise this isn't a day job thing, but the Essential Judge Dredd America collection, which collects the democracy storyline and a few bits and bobs as well, is really great because it just charts the movement, the hollowing out of democracy. And the overwhelming power of the judges.
I mean, would you say it's still doing that today as well? That's still the mission, as it were, of the comic today.
Yeah. I know there's various reviewers who go, well, everything you reference in the book is 40 years old. Yes, that's because it talks about predicting the future. Like, no point writing about a comic that was written a month ago, you know. But it is just doing it in a more subtle way. So Rob Williams and Arthur Wyatt are about to wrap up a long thread of stories, which is basically bringing defund the police to Megacity 1 and getting Dredd to have to answer finally the question, is it justice you're after, or are you just there to preserve the system? Because if it's the latter, fine, we can deal with you on that basis, but don't pretend it is about justice.
Yeah. Thank you. Are there any audience questions at this time?
This discussion raised so many concepts in my mind. I mean, the very fact that the whole society is police. You know, I think you may remember when the NHS had worries about wards sharing men and women together. And then you've also got the concept of always being woken up at a certain time. You can't relax in a ward easily. Unless you go private, you may even get a single room for yourself. I don't know about Sweden, I don't know if their NHS or their system, I don't know what an NHS, but if their system may enable you to stay in a single room. They may have developed that. But anyway, some people might prefer the ward because you've got company. But anyway, the thing is, there was a guy in Edinburgh as a chief of police, and he seemed in favour of demonstrations. He wanted them to happen because he thought it was a sociological function for people to demonstrate and let off steam. So you get varieties, you get now the very concept of a demonstration horrifies the state and the establishment. It's the exact opposite of that. I can't remember his name, but I remember I went on a massive demo. It was a small demo, but it caused massive chaos. It was when it was reclaim the streets. But I mean, you have to remember that the police can actually help people. They do occasionally help people, and they often get it completely wrong.
This is the delightful ambiguity about Judge Dredd, and why I think he's actually such a challenging satire is because he does save the baby that's falling off the ledge. He does shoot the criminal who's just murdered somebody. But as I said earlier, in order to do those things, he has to maintain a brutal system that beats people and prevents them from living lives of fulfillment and happiness. And I will keep this response short because otherwise I'm going to go off on a tangent. There's a writer called a criminologist called Clive Emsley, and sadly he died a couple of years ago. And he, one of his areas of expertise was the role of violence in English society. In fact, he wrote a very good book about it. And he talks about how riot used to be an important and accepted part of the political process. And we're talking pre-mass franchise days, pre the days of Waterloo and so Peterloo and things like that. But as urbanization progressed, the political structures that had accepted that the lower orders who did not have votes would riot when things got really bad, and so that was a way to indicate that they perhaps needed to think about changing things. They began to fear disorder, and so you have that period in the late 18th, early 19th centuries when the local militias, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, when local militias were used to suppress, Peterloo is a perfect example, suppress demonstrations and disorder and all this. And what that created was martyrs, because you can't enforce order at the point of a sword and not create rebellion. So England at that point was ripe for the idea of the police, of a means of social order that didn't rely on direct, immediate force. And that created a deep ambiguity. The concept of the policeman by consent, the concept of the police is so deeply ambiguous, because they could hurt us. They choose not to until they do. And then it really hurts, because then we realize actually what they are, which is just soldiers in blue coats. And you're entirely right. There are, I know police officers who spend their days doing great work, but it's a system that allows them power to suppress people and suppress our rights. And it's one of the great unanswered questions about what liberal democracy wants to do with the police. And it's not answering them at the moment. It runs away from this question. What are the police for? If they're there to preserve order, fine, they're an occupying force. Let's treat them that way. Or are they there to help us? In which case, please take their guns away and their tasers, because they're really hurting people. So I think where Dredd comes into this is that he embodies, he's the logical conclusion of that process of law and order politics, of basically saying the police can, by their very nature, are good and a social good. You go, well, eventually at the end of this process, you have somebody who can do anything. You know,
there's a strong temptation to see it in those kind of Weberian terms, where it's, if the state exists because of a monopoly of legitimate violence, the police are an instrument of that. And that's a way of looking at it, I suppose, that they are that the thing that guarantees the continued existence of the state.
Yeah, and I've got a whole chapter about the concept of death worthiness, which comes from American jurisprudence, but manifests itself in the idea that if you are hurt by the state, because the state holds the legitimate monopoly, well, the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, therefore the police's use of force is always legitimate. So therefore you have done something to deserve. You are guilty by having been hurt by the state, not because necessarily of anything you've done. So you always see it whenever somebody's shot by the police, whenever somebody's brutalized. I mean, they've just jailed a Kill the Bill protester for 2.5 years. Part of the evidence for that was his blood at the scene. Yes, blood that came on the receiving end of a police baton. Yeah. So it's that kind of that's why I think Judge Dredd is such a genius creation, is because he is a Rorschach test for the reader. Do you see him as a monster, or do you see him as a hero, or are you able to hold two ideas in your head at exactly contradictory ideas in your head at exactly the same time? That's the end of that sentence.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. That was great. Any other audience questions just now? Yes, please.
Recently, you were talking a little bit about the brief period when Dixon, Dodd Green was the idea. He said it wasn't before that point, but you didn't actually talk about presentation of the police before the Dixon, Dodd Green. Interested in that.
I mean, that can be summed up by one of the nicknames they received in the 1830s, which was blue locusts. So for better or for worse, England has long had narratives about personal liberty and independence. And I'll talk about that in the pub later. But when Robert Peel created the Metropolitan Police. The police have been tried before in various guises, and it usually centered around property. So the London docks had their own police force, which is basically a private security force to look after all the bonded wares that were in the warehouses. You had the Bow Street Runners, who were an incredibly corrupt group of thief takers, who essentially were just bounty hunters. But the idea of like a dedicated force, who received a regular salary, not necessarily based on results. When Robert Peel came along and introduced them, people hated them because they had these long memories of the police forces in Europe. The terror had ended in living memory. So the police were a political force in Europe, and a means of suppressing political dissent. So all the way through the 19th century, you have incredible amounts of resistance. And talking about kind of cultural amnesia, historical amnesia, we've forgotten how much we used to resist the police, how unwelcome they were in England, in particular. But what, and it's one of my favourite lines of the book, what Peel did and his successors was they convinced the middle classes, the people who had just enough property to fear crime. They convinced them that the police were not there to peer into parlours, but there to keep the dangerous classes out of it. And that was their role, was basically to police the poor and the undesirable. And so by the 1890s, despite waves of scandal, the moratorium on buying new books about policing that my wife had to impose while I was writing the book, I think because the book is now published, is now lapsed, so I can now buy all the books I want. I've just ordered one which is specifically about the police in the 1880s and 1890s. It's riddled with corruption, and they were viewed with humour and suspicion. They were called flatfoots. Phrases like coppers. That it wasn't actually intended as a nice term because their badge was made of a base metal. It wasn't gold or silver. It was copper. And then you start to come into the turn of the century, and the police start going on strike. So the government bans them from going on strike after the 1920s. And around about that point, what the state begins to realise is what they need is a better class of policemen. So more actually middle class, because up until that point it was a job for the working class, essentially getting the working class to police themselves. But you start to see, and they start to recruit an awful lot of officers from the armed forces, particularly the armed forces that were serving in Ireland. Because it's one aspect we haven't got into this evening. The police are a fundamentally colonial institution. So you get a lot of recruitment of officers who themselves are generally middle class, or at least retain middle class status. And by the post-war period, although you've got this image of the working class Bobby on the beat, they're becoming much more professionalized, and that gets hypercharged in the 1980s. After decades of scandal again, you then start to get them, officers have to have a degree. They have to go on training. Technology begins to play a much greater role in what they do. And so, and they become much more acutely aware of how they are perceived. So they try to smarten themselves up. But before that, the concept of the English police is antithetical to the notion of being English. And it's a tragedy that we've forgotten that.
There's an interesting trajectory there away from this idea that you could just get rid of the corruption. If you could remove those elements, and so you have this kind of pure essence of order. That's a liberal project as well. Like you said earlier, that is Judge Dredd in a lot of ways. Yeah. And it always comes. So I mean, this is a big conversation about the notion of police reform. Any reform efforts always come with handing the police more money and power. So at exactly the same time, around about 18 months ago, the Metropolitan Police started massively expanding its corruption units and its investigation units, because it kind of became unavoidable how many bad apples there were in the orchard.
And so when the new Met Commissioner started talking about the months of pain ahead, basically all the prosecutions that have come out of that boost in internal affairs spending, that's what's coming. They're trying to clean house as quickly as they can. But while that is happening, while we are still traumatized as a society by the murder of Sarah Everard, by the people are still clamoring for justice after all the BLM protests, and Carrick, of course, who was jailed recently. They're being given greater powers to decide what is disruptive, to be able to decide that because somebody has been at a protest in the past, therefore they can be stopped. They must be treated with suspicion forever. And so those two things always go hand in hand in a law and order state, which is what the sociologist Stuart Hall talked about in a seminal book. And I do recommend it. It's a hard read. It's very involved read. There's a book called Police in the Crisis, which is about the mugging crisis, mugging moral panic in the 1970s. A bit like neoliberalism, actually, it thrives on crisis. So when a crisis comes along, it shrinks a little bit to make it look as if it's listened, but then it massively expands its powers because it is an agent of crisis. It thrives on crisis. So yeah, that's all from there. Next question.
We're pretty much out of time, unfortunately, but there was one thing I wanted to end with, which was to ask you a slightly more general question about: do you think that comics as an art form are particularly suited to satire, or is there something that's particularly powerful as instruments of satire?
Yeah, they are, and I think it's because they are. I realise how often I use my funny fingers. I'm so sorry. It's just become like a tip. It's because the book's riddled with inverted commas for terms, and so I just started doing it in real life. And it's because they are low culture, and so they are easily dismissible, easily ignorable. We as a society have lost the role. Well, lost it a very long time ago, actually. Lost the role that comics actually play, particularly in working class culture. So it was infantilized. It became a thing for children. And I could go on about the rise of the novel in English society and the diminution of comics, but you look back to the origin of comics with the character that supposedly started it all was Ali Sloper, which is a fantastic satire of kind of the kind of drunken, bumbling, working class poor man, and his scripts did the same kind of thing that kind of Dickensian novels did. And so I think there still is an extraordinary power for comics, and certainly within the kind of more artist writer-led fields now, there's some great work there. But I still think, and this is a big topic for debate, that the thing about 2000 AD is, for all of its left-leaning, for all of its radical credentials, etc., it was still a weekly comic book produced for children by a multinational corporation that had lots of fingers in lots of pies. It was still a capitalist project. But because it was easily dismissible as being for kids, or being for nerds, or whatever, something people will grow out of, that gave it an incredible space just to do whatever the hell it wanted. And it did, and still does. Does it in different ways now, but it's still going on. And I think the fact that comic books play such a smaller part in our culture than they should is one of the great tragedies of the 20th century.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you everyone for coming out. If you wouldn't mind keeping your seats until Michael and I are through, we'll be able to sign some books through there. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking